Hello, bird crafters, and welcome to an episode called The Drifters. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing migration of a particular kind. It's called drift migration, and we're going to be looking at how that is going to hopefully show its face for us in the coming days and weeks, particularly hopefully on our journey to Spurn this coming weekend. All over the globe, there are migratory flyways. There are multiple flyways, even within the UK and Western Europe and the like, but there is a major migratory flyway in Western Europe. It's known as the East Atlantic Flyway. It stems from northern Norway, stretching right down through France and Spain and then down through to Africa, but it also clips the UK, and there's another sort of branch of that runs into us from Iceland. This is the source of most of what we call drift migrants. It's what we're going to be concentrating on, but as you look around you can see that there are other major flyways across the Americas and across Eastern Europe and across Australasia and of course Southeast Asia. This particular illustration clearly demonstrates there are multiple flyways just within Western Europe and even through the UK. It's only a guideline because, as we know, there are many more flyways than that even within our part of the UK. For instance, we were at Hale Head the other day, and although there was no migration going on particularly that day, we do know that's a major migration fly point for birds that want to cross the Mersey estuary. You know, something like 67,000 birds pass through there every autumn. So it's only guideline illustration, and that major strand running down the western edge of France and Spain and going down to Africa, that drifts around all over the place depending on weather conditions. So what actually is drift migration? There is an explanation written below here, you can read through that, but in truth it's a bit more complicated than is given down here, and I'll go into more detail as we go through. But the truth is there's an awful lot of young birds on the wing in the autumn. More young birds are around than there are adults, so there's bound to be more young birds caught up in the drift, and adult birds do get caught in drift migration as well. So it's not true to say that it's just inexperienced birds, it's just an awful lot of them. Young birds are more prone to heading off in poor conditions and getting caught out than the adults are. So there's multiple explanations to why we get drift migrants being dominated by young birds. There are a combination of factors which make drift migration more likely. Obviously the time of year when the conditions are occurring are a key feature of that, particularly in the autumn. Any time from July through to middle of October you can get drift migration occurring and big numbers of birds being involved in it. But ostensibly what you require is a high pressure area over the western part of but northern part of Europe, so it's like covering the Scandinavian Baltic region, and then usually what is required to encourage drift migration, because there's an easterly airflow anyway, is that the birds are going to run into the top edge, if you like, of a low pressure area running up the English Channel and then up into the North Sea. And what happens is birds have set off from Scandinavia in good conditions, and then they run into really poor weather and they get disoriented and they're burning a lot of fuel. And what many of them choose to do in those circumstances is to throttle back a little bit to stay in the air longer but go with the wind, which then drags them across and drifts them onto the east coast. And in these conditions you can get very big falls of birds, and you don't need it to create a movement of drift migration. You just need that easterly airflow caused by the high pressure over northern Europe. But when you've got that combination of factors, it multiplies it by a magnitude possibly of tenfold. There's a very large number of species that get caught up in drift migration. Many regular species that are common in the UK already, things like pied flycatchers, spotted flycatchers, redstarts, all that kind of stuff. They'll often end up getting caught in a drift migration from the continent and ending up down the east coast. But what we're going to look at here are some of those species that other than through drift migration, we scarcely see these days in the UK. We'll begin with what I regard as one of our most fascinating, intriguing species, the Eurasian wryneck. When you first look at it, you may wonder where it sits in the order of things, but it's actually got a long sticky tongue and 2 toes forward and 2 toes back, just like a woodpecker. And in fact, it is a type of woodpecker, but not a typical one. It lacks the stiff tail of most woodpeckers, so therefore you rarely, if ever, see it perched upright on a tree trunk. You will see it on branches, however, but mostly you see it on the ground where it's hunting for ground invertebrates, principally ants and other things like that. But the reason it's cryptic is probably because you're very vulnerable when you're feeding on the ground in an open space, and therefore it needs to be camouflaged against things like kestrels and maybe buzzards as well. And the bird's name wryneck comes from the fact that it will twist and contort and turn its neck and head around when threatened by a predator. Ringers will know this because when the ringer's got them in the hand, it will do it continuously. And it gives it its alternative name of snake bird because it rather reminds one of a snake threatening a potential predator. The cuckoo's mate comes from the fact that the bird arrives around about the same time as cuckoos in the UK and other parts of Northern Europe. Although I'm going to correct that actually in some sense because it doesn't really arrive in the UK anymore. What happens is that the bird does arrive up in the likes of Speyside area where they now believe there's a nucleated population extending from the Scandinavian population. But the English population, which used to be extensive in southern England, has completely disappeared. Up until the 1950s, it was common in orchards in Kent and other places, and then slowly slipped away so that by the 1980s it had become effectively extinct as a breeding bird in England. One of the things that I always look to with this bird is its actual scientific name, which is Jinx torquilla or torquilla, and the torquilla bit is related to the twisting and turning of the neck, but the jinx is somewhat different. It's from the Greek iunx, and an iunx was said to have been a small, sexually rapacious bird that Greek men would tie on a wheel and then torture. The idea behind this is that it would fill the objects of their lust with burning, irresistible passion. I mean, you can never get your hands on a wryneck when you really need one these days. And just to make matters even more difficult, Selene, the Greek goddess of the moon, well, she regarded the wryneck as magical and her prime orgiastic bird. Now, here's the problem. From now on, you're not going to be able to get that thought out of your head. Let's just see if I can get that orgiastic thought out of your head for a moment while we concentrate on why this bird is so commonly regarded as a drift migrant these days. The majority of birds that turn up in the UK are from this Scandinavian population, and they tend to turn up in August and early September, and that's when the birds are making their way down to Africa from across Scandinavia. Under drift conditions, high pressure systems settled over that part of the world, sometimes combining with a low pressure system running up the channel, then they will drift across the North Sea in some numbers. They'll end up at places like Gibraltar Point, Spurn and Flamborough Head. And some do actually make it across all the way to the west, particularly somewhere like South Stack often catches a wryneck or two most autumns. And I do know that one or two of you managed to catch up with a wryneck very recently in the Horwich area of Bolton. Some years it seems to be that the east coast is dripping in wrynecks, and other years there's only the odd bird turning up, so it's very much a weather-based phenomenon as to whether we get lucky and see Eurasian wryneck in the UK each autumn in numbers. Shrikes are amongst my favourite birds, and red-backed shrikes are particularly dapper. They're commonly associated with drift migration, almost twinned with wrynecks. They're twinned in other senses as well, because they used to be a common breeding bird in lots of places in southern England, particularly the orchards of Kent and the like. And they rapidly declined in the 50s and 60s to the point where by the 1980s came along just a single pair was left breeding at a place called Santon Downham. They do, however, just like the wryneck, occasionally throw up an extra pair in somewhere like Speyside. And in fact, this year, a pair actually bred on Shetland. So they're still occurring sporadically, and they're probably Scandinavian birds that are drifted across in the springtime. But main drift migration occurs in the autumn, as we know, and this bird can be relatively easily found along the east coast at particular times of year, again in the same conditions that produce the wryneck and many other drift migrants as well. So when we get to Spurn on this weekend and on future dates, we'll be thinking late August, mid-September, we ought to be thinking about shrikes. When it comes to warblers, they don't come much bigger than barred warbler. It's a big lumpen thing that when it's moving within a bush or a shrub will make the branches move, although it still means you probably won't see it because they're quite skulky as well. But when they do pop out, you see generally a pale brownish looking bird with a pale throat. Normally, because it's a juvenile, very rarely do adults turn up here because, as again we know that juveniles tend to get drifted more frequently than adults do. They do turn up at Spurn and Flamborough with regularity, so when we're at Spurn at the weekend, this is definitely a species we're going to be keeping a weather eye closely out for. We'll look now at a classic species pair, greenish warbler and Arctic warbler. They often get mixed up because they look so similar. There are a few things you can look at to help you identify them. Greenish warbler, apart from anything else, tends to arrive a bit earlier than Arctic warbler, usually mid-August through to early September. It's a rather shorter winged bird than Arctic warbler, so look at the primary projection. That's the thing that will help you. The eyebrow or supercilium on the greenish warbler certainly seems to be rather large and flaring behind the eye, and it will extend onto the forehead as well. And it doesn't have a sort of contrasting cap or a particularly dark line through the eye in comparison to Arctic warblers, something we'll look at in a moment. It's got pale flanks and it's got grey-brown legs, and it's a bird that around about the same size as a chiffchaff. Arctic warbler is somewhat rarer than greenish warbler in the UK in the autumn, but I was lucky enough to find one myself at Spurn a couple of years ago, and I noticed immediately that it seemed to have a much more prominent capped appearance than greenish warbler. It also had a very thin, long supercilium that drooped down behind the eye. It did have the two wing bars, just as greenish warbler often has, but it's got a much longer primary projection, which helps you to identify it compared to greenish warbler. There are other distinctions as well. It's got rather dingier looking flanks, and the leg colour is more brownish pink. It tends to arrive mid-September. That's the primary period for the Arctic warbler. Red-spotted bluethroat is a relatively common drift migrant onto the east coast of the UK during the autumn. Rarely in big numbers, they're usually in ones and twos dotted about here and there, and they're often quite skulky, so they're quite hard to spot sometimes. And if you go down somewhere like the Algarve or parts of marshes in southern Spain during the winter, you'll often come across hordes of them down there, and you can see that we're only getting a tiny fraction drifted across on any given time. They look rather robin-like when you actually see a bluethroat. That's possibly what you will actually think you're seeing when you first spot it, especially if you spot it from behind. And if you do so, watch out for the tail, because it's got orange patches on either side of the tail. It's time now for a pretty difficult species pair. We're going to do icterine warbler, which is pictured here, and melodious warbler, which you'll see shortly. Very hard to separate out when you see them in the field, but there are things you can look for. They've got longer wings on the icterine warbler, and you've got a rather peaked looking head on the icterine warbler, and normally a rather rounded crown on the melodious warbler. Both rather yellowish and brown looking birds. Both belong to a group called the Hippolaeus warblers. Rarely do you get them together because they're coming in from different localities, so the different drift conditions are required for different ones to turn up. So if there's a high pressure quite high to the north, then you might get icterine warbler coming across, whereas the more southerly breeding melodious warbler will need high pressure systems emanating from central Europe and drifting birds up from the southeast. They do turn up together in one or two places, the Isles of Scilly being a classic example. Melodious warbler tends to have a slightly shorter primary projection, which looks a bit blunter, which might help you identify it. That rounded crown that I mentioned before, slightly shorter bill, and it's a plumper looking bird altogether, but by gum it is hard to separate them out. I've done it a number of times on places like the Isles of Scilly. It's a challenge, it's never easy. The bird on the left here is a black tern, and black terns are regular passage migrants through the UK, but the numbers vary enormously, and under real drift conditions we can get very large numbers coming through in the autumn. Sometimes 200 birds can turn up at any given locality. The bird on the right is a white-winged black tern, a much rarer, much more easterly biased species in its distribution. But there's a clear distinction, as you can see. It's got a white tail and rump compared to the black tern. And so if you do happen to spot a tern and it's got the white rump and tail, think white-winged black tern. There'll be roughly 100 black terns for every white-winged black tern that turns up. You wouldn't expect wading birds, which are really strong flying birds, powerful migrants, to be particularly impacted by drift migration conditions. You'd expect them to be able to direct their flight wherever they wish, but in fact they do get heavily influenced by drift migration conditions, and a species like the curlew sandpiper can vary its numbers turning up in the UK in a given year by tenfold. So for instance, when there are no drift conditions occurring, we only get dribs and drabs of curlew sandpipers, mostly juveniles just knocked slightly off course or going wrong, and hardly any adults. When they've got strong drift conditions, we can get big numbers coming in through the UK, sometimes many hundreds at a given locality, and most of them will be comprising these rather buffish juvenile birds with these pale fringed scapulars and tertials and the like. So yeah, look out for curlew sandpipers on any body of water, freshwater body of water, where you're likely to get things like dunlin and stints and the like, and check amongst them for a longer legged, longer billed bird. The little stint is another species. Its numbers vary enormously year to year depending on the drift conditions that occur. And on the perfect year, we'll get hundreds at any given locality. Here we've got a nice image of them, a young bird with its braces over its back and its short bill and its little legs. Behind it is a dunlin for size comparison. So you can see it really is a very small bird, very compact, with a big area of white belly that often shows below as the bird is feeding. Spurn Bird Observatory is probably one of the most famous in the UK. Spurn itself is a mecca for bird watchers, particularly those from Midlands and Northern England, and most of us make a pilgrimage there at least once a year, and you never know what's going to turn up. But it's not the same species all the time. You've got to pick your moments, and if you want to know more about when to go, I strongly recommend that you go on the sightings board of the Spurn Bird Observatory on the website, and you can then glean from that the ideal time to turn up at Spurn to target your particular favoured birds. That's why we're going now. We're going to hopefully pick up wryneck and redback shrike at the weekend. We may not, and we may. It's all down to the weather. To finish our session, we're just going to drift away from drift migration and just focus a little bit on one or two of the seabirds that we can anticipate seeing at Spurn at this particular time of year. And we're going to start with skuas, and we're going to start with two of the skuas that we rarely see in the UK, but we're hitting the prime time to spot them. This one is a Pomerine skua. And Pomerine skuas are bulky skuas compared to Arctic and long-tailed skua. And this is a juvenile bird, but you can see that it's got a rather blunt central tail feathers that are rather thick and prominent, but they don't extend into a point. That gives us a clue that it's a pom. The heavy thick set attitude of the bird and the sort of double white flash on the underwing is another aid. But you do need to be trying to compare them with Arctic skuas to be certain that you're looking at a Pomerine skua. Long-tailed skua is a bit of a prize bird on any sea watch, and your best chances this time of year when there's lots of juveniles coming down the oceanic areas of the UK. They not often come that close to land, but when they do, they'll often just drift right over your head rather than being right out over the open ocean. The skua itself, long-tailed skua, is a really lightweight bird, very, very buoyant. It's almost like comparing an Arctic skua to, say, a sandwich tern, and a long-tailed skua to an Arctic tern. So there's a difference in the buoyancy. The long tail, central feathers, are usually fairly prominent, even on a juvenile, but the easiest way is to look at that double white shaft on the outer part of the wing, whereas Arctic skua has about 4 or 5 feathers with that feature on each side of the wing. So a long-tailed skua, Pomeranian skua, definite possibilities at Spurn this coming weekend. It's a bit of a surprise that Spurn is such a good place to see sooty shearwater when you consider it breeds in Tristan da Cunha and is very oceanic. So why does it end up in the North Sea? Well, what happens is basically birds are coming up the Irish Sea and the top part of the Atlantic, and if there's a storm track or whatever that shunts them across the top, they'll often end up going down into the area of the North Sea, spending a little time in there before coming back northwards past Spurn. That's what I expect us to see at the weekend. The thing to look out for with sooty shearwater is obviously that long thin wing, but also the white flashes, silvery white flashes on the underwing, which are very contrasty on a chocolatey dark brown bird, and it looks somewhat longer and lankier than Manx shearwater. Sooty shearwaters and great shearwaters, which this is, both breed in Tristan da Cunha, but for every great shearwater you see at Spurn, you're going to see maybe 500 sooty shearwaters, but they do occur, and I've been there when one has gone past. So hey, let's keep our eye out for a bird that's got a dark cap and a white collar and a white crescent above the tail, and maybe if you look carefully on the other side, you see it's got a darkish brown belly patch as well. They're a bit bigger than sooty shearwaters, a bit lumpier, but they're stunning looking birds. Maybe we'll spot one. There are so many species to choose from at Spurn, it's hard to know what to select out, but the one bird I would like to finish up with here is little gull. Dainty little things, you know, with a dusky underwing, adults with a pure white wingtips, and at this time of year obviously it'll have just a little spot behind the eye and a bit of a smudge on the cap of the head, and also sort of a grey collar as well. Gorgeous little things, almost tern-like in flight, and certainly that northeast area of the North Sea, well, that's a fantastic locality for them, and you can get big numbers coming down that part of the coastline, and maybe we'll be lucky and see many little gulls when we're sea watching on Saturday. If you go onto the Spurn Bird Observatory website, you can go back through the archive to see what occurred at the equivalent time of year. So if we take the 12th of September as our date, you look at 2019, you can see there was quite a good movement of birds in the morning time, with lots of swallows and house martins, tree sparrows, and lots of meadow pipits going through on visible migration. There were also roseate terns knocking around, and a grey phalarope and barred warbler. There were spoonbills, white rump sandpipers, and also some curlew sandpipers. So some of the things I've covered here were clearly present on the 2019 12th of September. And if we go back to 2018 on the 12th of September, you can see that there was a rosefinch in the area, and that's definitely a drift migrant from the continent. And some short-eared owls have started to show as well, which meant they were coming in off the sea. Willow warblers, flycatchers, redstarts, windchats, wheatears, all mentioned in the report for that particular period. And again, there was a good movement of birds in the early part of the morning. So you never know what you're going to get at Spurn. It varies very much from day to day. We could be lucky, and we could be there on a mega day. Who knows? Let's cross our fingers.